followed my YouTube channel for a while, you've probably seen this rod where I did a spiral decorative wrap on the split grip of a rod I was building for my daughter. People seem to like it, so I thought I'd do a tutorial on how you actually do these decorative spiral wraps that look pretty easy, but some of the layout techniques are the same sort of techniques that you'll use for doing other types of wraps like diamond patterns. I posted a picture and a little teaser blurb about a video I was going to be working on about this. Posted it on a Facebook group that I belong to, and I will put a link in the description to that group. It's a good rod building group if you're interested in joining one. In fact, there's two of them I belong to. I'll just put a link to both in the description. But a few people posted some pictures of similar wraps or spiral type wraps. One person calls them a barber pole type, which I can understand that too. But I thought I'd share those pictures here, and they might give you some inspiration for things that you're going to want to try at some point. I've said before quite often that I'm not the most artistic rod builder there is, so I kind of tend to keep things pretty simple, but these are pretty interesting, and you might get some ideas from these photos that other people have done also. This is going to be kind of a basic wrap. I'm going to use two colors. On the blue color, I'm using 3 wraps in the middle. Then it's outlined on both sides by 1 wrap of a brown thread. Then there's 5 wraps of blue on each side and 2 outline threads in brown again to close out the decorative wrap. Just a couple quick notes here. The rod blank I'm using is an old one, and it really needs to be refinished, so you'll notice little holes and pitting in it. I'm using it just for demonstration purposes. This isn't going to be a permanent wrap, so I'm also not going to spend a lot of time closing out the gaps on the threads and doing burnishing and things like that. So you might notice on some of the close-ups there's some small gaps and things. I'm using a polyester embroidery thread, which is a little smaller in diameter than size A rod wrapping thread. Checking your wraps under magnification is a good idea if you have access to a magnifying glass to help you fill in the gaps by burnishing and pushing your threads around a little bit to close out the gaps. I'm not going to go through all that for demonstration purposes. I'm just going to show you how to lay the wrap out and how to do it, and hopefully it'll help you out. The most difficult part about doing these wraps is the layout itself. If you'll use the tools that I showed how to make in a previous video, it makes that process really easy and quick. What some people do is take tape, wrap it around the blank on both ends of the wrap and mark the end, and then measure that out and divide it up into sections. I've used the tape method and I don't really like it. The things I don't like about using tape is it's not very repeatable. Keeping it lined up with your 0 position, which would be your reel seat, basically is what I use for my 0 position, the center of the reel seat where the reel foot would go. It's hard to keep a piece of tape in line with that, to take it off, mark it, and put it back on. And another thing is I have kind of oily skin, so if I'm handling tape, it's not going to be sticky for very long. And if you use a stronger tape, it's hard to get it back off when you want it off. So I don't like taking the tape, putting it on, taking it back off, marking it, wrapping it around. You'll see in this video the tape doesn't want to stick after I've handled it a little bit. So I came up with these other tools, and I think they make the whole process a lot easier, a lot more repeatable, and they really don't take any longer to lay out doing it this way either. I think it's worth the investment in time to make these tools for yourself so you'll have them when you need them. But the option of using the tape is there if you want to use that too. I'm showing you very briefly how to do that on this video, and you might run into some of the same problems I have with using it, or you might like it. Either way, it's going to work. Your main goal here is just to get your wrap laid out, so you can use that method if you want to. I'm going to show you real quickly how I use the dividing wheel, my indicator pointer, guide blank, height center marking tool that's a stand for a marker, and the mark transfer tool so you can transfer marks from one end of the blank to the other and keep them centered. And I will put links in the description and in the top right hand corner of this video to all these different tools so you can go check them out and see if you want to make some for yourself. And I'm using 4 quadrants. I'm going to start with the 0 position, and I'm going to 0 out the dividing wheel on the back of the rod. Again, this tool, I'll put a link up here in the top right hand corner so you can go check that out. You can see that video on how you make one of these dividing wheels that really makes layout easy. So we're going to start at the 0 position and mark the end closest to the grip. Then we're going to rotate the rod 90 degrees and make another mark. Then we're going to rotate it 90 more degrees and make another mark. And for the fourth quadrant, we're going to rotate it another 90 degrees. So now we're at the 270 degree position on the wheel and make the final mark. So now we've got the rod divided into 4 equal quadrants. We're going to need to transfer those marks down to the opposite end of the wrap. And to do that, I'm going to use a blank marking tool that I showed how to make in a previous video. It will allow you to quickly transfer a mark from one end to the other while staying centered on the blank itself. So I'm just going to line that up and transfer my marks to the other end of the wrap. And I'm going to do that for all 4 of the marks. So we've got the 4 quadrants marked on each end of the wrap. After I've got all 4 of the quadrants marked, I go ahead and write 0 on my 0 line for reference purposes. Your 0 position could be your reel seat where the center of the reel foot would sit, could be the spine of the blank. Whatever you choose for your 0 reference, it's a good idea to have a reference point that you know you can always come back to and be in the same position. On this wrap, I decided to use 1/2 inch spacing just because it looked right visually to me when I laid out some spaced at 1/2 inch intervals. So that's what I'm doing on this wrap. If you've got a really wide blank or if you've got a really narrow part of a blank, you'll want to adjust your spirals accordingly. You can just wind some thread onto the rod blank and look at it and get a good idea if you feel like your spacing's about right. The areas to me that looked the best were around 1/2 inch wide, so that's what I went with on this one. To start laying this wrap out now, I'm going to mark on my 0 position, and I'm going to mark every 1/2 inch with a dot on the blank. I found the washable Crayola markers work really well. They can be wiped off if you need to, almost like using the blank as a dry erase board. You can use whatever marker you want to use, but they're cheap and they work pretty well, I think. I'll probably catch some heat from this from the metric guys. I use metric and standard or imperial measurements, whatever you want to call them. I use them both interchangeably, just whatever's most convenient for me at the time. And because the rod is divided into 4 quadrants and inches are based in 1/16 of an inch, to me, in my mind and the way it works, it's easier to deal with that than it is metric system, which is based on 10. Because I've decided to lay my wraps out on 1/2 inch spacing on center of the wrap, I know that a 1/4 of a 1/2 of an inch would be an 1/8 of an inch. So each time I turn the rod 1/4 of a turn, my spiral wrap needs to advance up the rod 1/8 of an inch. I hope that makes sense to you. So the way I'm laying this out is on my 0 position, I've marked the rod every 1/2 of an inch. 90 degrees from that, I want to mark the rod 1/8 of an inch ahead of those 1/2 inch marks. What that means for me is that I will just start with my ruler back at the same position and I will mark the rod based on 1 inch sections. I will mark the rod on every 1 inch section at the 1/8 mark and at the 5/8 mark. My first dot would be at 1/8 of an inch. My second dot would be at 5/8 of an inch. My third dot would be at 1 1/8 of an inch. My fourth dot would be at 1 5/8 of an inch. My fifth dot would be at 2 1/8 of an inch. My sixth dot would be 2 5/8 of an inch, and so on and so forth for however many inches long your wrap is. Then you will rotate the rod, and for every inch interval, you will mark the rod at 1/4 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch. And that will advance the thread up the rod another 1/4 of the way that it's going in its complete revolution of travel. Then you'd rotate the rod again 90 more degrees, and you'd mark the rod every 3/8 of an inch and every 7/8 of an inch for every inch interval. You'd mark the rod at 3/8 of an inch, 7/8 of an inch, 1 3/8 of an inch, 1 7/8 of an inch, and so on for however many inches long your wrap is. And that makes the thread advance 1/8 of an inch every 1/4 rotation of the rod. When it goes 4 quarters, it's come all the way back around to 1/2 an inch forward of where you started from. There are ways to cheat and easily and quickly lay out a wrap like this without measuring it all out. I'm not showing you how to do that right now because I think it's important. I try to focus on people that are just getting started with rod building. I think it's important for you to learn how to lay these things out. That way, as you progress into things like diamond patterns, that it's not so foreign to you. You'll be familiar with laying out the rod this way, and it will become easy for you. You can cheat and use a ribbon. You can lay a ribbon down and use that as a guide where you want to make your spirals go. You can do things like that. But if you learn how to do this layout technique right now, it'll pay off in the long run for you. But there are different ways to do this wrap. You can even just eyeball it if you're really good at that. But for our purposes right now, I really want to try to help people understand how you lay these things out, and this will help you in the future. There's a cheat sheet on the screen right now, and you can screen capture that, print it out, whatever you want to do. But 1/2 inch spacing is a good size. 1/2 inches on center. It works for a lot of different things. If you have a very wide or a very narrow rod, it won't work for you. But for a lot of applications, 1/2 inch center on spacing is a good size to use. So you might find this cheat sheet useful, and it might help you as you get started learning how to lay these things out also. I kind of jumped the gun on the video a little bit. I didn't get the right kind of footage I wanted for this, but I want to try to make this work. I do my tape ends a very specific way and for a reason. First thing I do is lay down a little bit of 1.5 inch painter's tape, blue painter's tape on the rod, of course well away from where I want my finished wrap to be. I do that on each end, and then I roll some 3/4 inch masking tape on to get a little bit of an elevated height to it, and I offset that just from the edge on one side of the blue painter's tape. So there's a little blue painter's tape sticking out below where I build this area up of 3/4 inch masking tape, and that gets the elevation up a little bit off the rod blank itself. Then I put on some double-sided tape on top of that masking tape. And there's a reason why I use this method for laying out my tape where I want to terminate and start my wraps at on a decorative wrap like this. And I'll get to that here in a little bit. When I go to remove all this, you'll see why I did what I did here. And I think you'll find this to be a helpful way to do that also. Now we're just going to connect the dots with thread. There's a couple different ways that you can do your thread lay down. You can cut off lengths of thread and use that, and I'm going to show that technique, and I'm also going to show another technique. This is the way I prefer it. I use the spool of thread and I hold it in my hand and I use my fingers to tension the thread. That works just fine for ordinary thread. If you're using metallic thread, I'd suggest using the pieces, the cut pieces. That way you're not letting your fingers slide down the metallic thread and possibly damaging the foil. You'll just have to remember to adjust your grip position on the thread while holding tension on the rod blank so that you're not dragging your fingers across that metallic thread, because it can damage the thread and leave some knots or twisting in it, and with the foil that's wrapped into it, it can cause you some problems. I started this first thread on the 0 position dot that was on the tape, and I'm just following the dots in a spiral pattern all the way down to the end, where I will put a couple of wraps on the end on that double-sided sticky tape to hold it in place. Then I'll cut my next piece and lay one down to the side of that one, and then I'll come back with my third piece on the other side of the middle thread, the initial thread, and that will give me my first 3 threads that make up the center of this wrap. I'm speeding the video up through the wrapping process. That's actually the easy part to me on this particular wrap. There isn't a whole lot to see there. I personally go through and straighten up my wraps as I put them down. A lot of people will just get them down quickly and then come back and move the threads around. It really doesn't matter one way or the other. I just find it easier for me personally to keep everything fairly neat as I go. That way there's not any surprises when I get done, when I start trying to move the threads around long distances. How you do that's really up to you. This is just the way I prefer to do it. You do want to make sure that you're maintaining tension as you're wrapping, and if for some reason you need to stop and adjust your hand position, I'd suggest putting a finger on the rod blank where the thread is that you're wrapping to hold that so it doesn't move on you. Adjust your hand position and then continue on with your wrapping. Now that I've got my 3 threads of blue in the middle section, I'm going to come back and put a single thread of brown on each side of the middle section. And that will give me a brown outline on each side of the middle 3 threads that are blue. And because they're quite a bit darker than the blue, they're going to stand out quite a bit too. Again, I'm just straightening up as I go along here. And if you'll stick with me through the end of this video, when I get ready to clean this wrap up, you'll see why I did what I did with the tape earlier. It's a really easy way to take care of your numerous tag ends that are going to be on the ends of your wrap. Now I'm going to put 5 wraps of blue on each side of those brown wraps that outline the middle section. And I'm going to skip through a lot of that and speed through a lot of the video. And here in a little bit, you'll see that I've switched over to using the thread off the spool in my hand. I wanted to show both ways to do that. Using the spool in your hand to me is a lot easier and faster than cutting off pieces. You've got something bigger to hold on to. However you want to do it's fine. It doesn't really make that much difference. You might run into some trouble on metallic threads coming off the spool directly. If you're careful, you can do it that way. You might find it easier to just cut off sections of metallic thread. Just remember again to adjust your grip as you go so that you're not twisting or crimping or knotting up the metallic thread as you go along there. After I've got the 5 wraps of blue on each side of the brown, then I'm going to come back with 2 threads of brown on each side of the blue to finish this wrap off. Now I'm ready to put some trim bands down at the ends where I want my wrap to stop and start at. That's just going to depend on what you're doing, what you're building. For mine, I'm going to have my trim band stop roughly at the edge of the tape that I laid down to mark my blank for my 4 quadrants initially. I'm going to terminate the ends of the trim bands at those tape lines. And there's nothing special about this. You're just wrapping over the end with a normal wrap. And this will be your trim band. I'm choosing to use brown for this one. What I'm going to do is make about half of that wrap. And then I'm going to clean up my ends, and this is where all that tape I put down earlier really comes in handy. Hopefully you'll be able to see all this on the video here. The blue painter's tape sticking out from underneath the rolled up masking tape that's somewhat elevated. There's a couple reasons for the blue painter's tape. For one, it's easy to peel off the blank itself. It comes off really easily. And for another thing, I'm able to leave it sticking out a little on one end where the masking tape is elevated. That gives me some protection from scratching my blank with my scissors or a razor blade or whatever I'm using while I cut these threads. And because of the elevation difference between the masking tape and the blue painter's masking tape underneath, the threads are sticking up a little bit off the blank itself because they're elevated up on top of that rolled up masking tape. Several layers of it lets it stick up higher, so I can get my scissors up under the threads, or you could use a razor blade. So I'm not going to scratch the blank, and I don't have to be up against the blank with anything made out of metal either, because the threads are elevated a little bit here. So once I get all of the threads trimmed away, all that's left to do is to cut the masking tape and the double stick tape off and unroll it off the rod. I'll trim up a little bit around the trim band that I'm putting down and finish covering over those tag ends with that trim band. And that's a pretty easy cleanup process, really. Once you get both ends finished, at that point, ordinarily what I would do would be to put on my color preserver if I'm using it, and then a really thin layer of epoxy. And then I've got another video that shows how to level out trim bands because they won't ever be quite even where you've wrapped over a bunch of threads like this. I'll put a link to it up in the top right hand corner of this video. But basically what you're going to do is put your light coat of epoxy on everything, and then wrap another trim band over the top of your original one, and that will make it look more level because the epoxy levels out on top of the original trim band, and then you put another coat of epoxy over the whole thing. But that's about it. That's how you do these barber pole or spiral decorative wraps, whatever you want to call them. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful, and I will talk to y'all later.